Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Descartes. Why Descartes? First of all, because Descartes is a major, unavoidable figure in French philosophy. It's very hard to bypass him. He's really the kind of philosopher who brought something new to the way of thinking. He was extremely influential in his time and on European thought in general. And so, talking about philosophy without mentioning Descartes is a bit complicated. If I had to define Descartes in order to introduce this presentation, I would say that he is, above all, obsessed with truth. Of course, that's a somewhat reductive formula, because you can't sum up Descartes solely by this aspect of his approach, but it is nonetheless a very important element of Cartesian thought, the obsession with truth. So what do I mean by obsession with truth? In a sense, all philosophers are obsessed with truth. That's the very principle behind philosophy. A philosopher is someone who seeks truth and wants to reach it at all costs. But with Descartes, this obsession takes a rather radical form. Terrified of being mistaken, of being in error, of being wrong, Descartes goes so far as to question everything he believes he knows. According to him, this is the very foundation of the philosophical method, questioning, doubting everything we believe to be true, our beliefs, our prejudices, our impressions. It's important to know that Descartes was not only a philosopher, but also a scientist, a mathematician, and a physicist. He did not separate philosophy from scientific research in general. In fact, the separation between philosophy and science only really became established in the 19th century. Before that, philosophy and science coexisted quite naturally and were not seen as rivals or competitors. Drawing on his scientific method, Descartes decided to apply it to the search for truth and to philosophical knowledge. What he observed is that we are all full of false ideas. These false ideas are not entirely our fault. They are not simply the result of natural ignorance or human stupidity. Rather, they arise from a combination of many factors that regularly lead us into error. He gives several examples. He talks about education and instruction, about the things we have been taught. Descartes points out that we sometimes learn things that are not entirely consistent with reality. You know this very well, since you went to school just like I did. Since the time you were in school, some things have been revised, corrected, or updated. This is especially true in history, which is a constantly evolving and rewritten discipline. But even in the sciences, there are things that were considered valid 20 or 30 years ago that no longer are today. School textbooks evolve, and it's true that we can learn things in childhood that later turn out to be false. But education is not the only thing Descartes criticizes. He also criticizes what he calls opinion. Opinion is, roughly speaking, what everyone thinks, ideas that have no real foundation or justification. It is the lowest level of knowledge, knowledge that is not truly knowledge at all. Therefore, we must be very suspicious of it. Concretely, this means we should not blindly trust what we are told. We should not take information at face value without verifying it first. And it doesn't stop there. Beyond education and opinion, Descartes even claims that our very constitution as human beings predisposes us to error. The example he gives is that of our five senses. Descartes shows that our senses frequently deceive us. We see things, hear things, feel things, and yet we misunderstand their nature or origin. We are subject to illusions.
The most well-known examples are optical illusions, seeing something that doesn't really exist or isn't actually there. There are also auditory illusions, such as when we think we hear our name being called in the street, when in reality it was just a sound that vaguely resembled it. We've all experienced sensory illusions, and we know that it's possible to be mistaken, to have a biased or distorted perception of reality. Therefore, we cannot fully trust our senses in the pursuit of knowledge. So the starting point for Descartes is the observation of all the obstacles to knowledge. He insists heavily on this. In fact, I strongly encourage you to read Discourse on the Method, because that is where Descartes presents his method in the clearest and most accessible way. In that book, he recounts his intellectual journey in an almost autobiographical manner, his childhood, his education, his studies, and he accumulates evidence showing that knowledge is fragile, precarious, and based on many false beliefs, opinions, and prejudices. This is what drives Descartes' method, identifying everything that can hinder our access to knowledge. The great difficulty for us as human beings is that we only access the world through our senses, and our senses are doubtful, unreliable. We must be wary of what they tell us. One example I often give my students is the example of a stick placed in water. Descartes tells us that if you immerse a stick in a stream and look at it at the surface of the water, it appears bent or broken, as if it were split in two, which is impossible. Simply removing the stick from the water shows that it was never broken, yet we saw it as broken because we were victims of an optical illusion that made reality appear differently from what it truly is. From this kind of example, Descartes concludes that we should never trust our senses and never trust our opinions. His method is one of radical distrust toward anything that could be a source of error, not only what has been proven false, but anything that could be false. And what could be false? According to Descartes, potentially everything that has not been verified or demonstrated. As long as something has not been proven with absolute certainty, it cannot be held as true and must be considered potentially false. This leads Descartes to suspend all beliefs, all knowledge, all opinions, in order to rebuild knowledge on solid foundations. This approach is known as methodical doubt, also called radical doubt or hyperbolic doubt. Why hyperbolic? Because it is an exaggeration. Descartes does not truly believe that everything is false. He himself admits that while rebuilding knowledge, we must continue to live using our old beliefs. We cannot withdraw from the world entirely. This is why he maintains what he calls a provisional morality, a temporary moral framework adopted while awaiting to verify whether it is well-founded. Descartes therefore begins to doubt everything, what he sees, what he hears, what he thinks he knows, and eventually even himself. If my senses are doubtful, then I cannot be absolutely certain of my bodily existence, since I only know my body through sensory experience. And since sensory experience is unreliable, I cannot use it to deduce my existence. Thus, Descartes concludes that he must doubt his own existence, at least his physical existence, just as he doubts everything that comes from the senses, beliefs, and opinions that lack absolute certainty. His philosophy can almost be described as a philosophy of paranoia. If an error is possible, even if the probability is extremely small, the risk exists, and if the risk exists, it must be avoided. One could say that Descartes doubted in order to be certain. By doubting everything, he ensures that he will never be deceived. Ironically, the philosopher most devoted to truth reaches it through doubt. For Descartes, doubt is not an end in itself. It is merely a tool, an instrument serving a method whose goal is to eliminate all risk of error. At the end of Descartes' reasoning, one thing resists doubt: doubt itself. If I can doubt everything, that proves that my doubt exists. Doubt is not material or physical, it is immaterial. It is a form of thought. And thought is something we cannot be mistaken about. You can have an optical illusion, but if you are thinking something, even if it is an illusion, it is still a thought.
Just as a dream is not real, but exists as a dream. Doubt exists as doubt. Therefore, thought exists. This is an absolute, self-evident truth. From this, Descartes reaches his first fundamental truth: thought exists. And if thought exists, then something must exist that thinks. This leads to the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." Personally, I'm not entirely convinced by this formulation because the "I" already implies a linguistic and cultural assumption. The pronoun I does not exist in all languages, and the expression of individuality is not universal. From a logical point of view, one could argue that thought does not necessarily require an individual subject. Nietzsche, for example, argued that we do not have ideas, ideas come to us. Nevertheless, Descartes' point is to impose the certainty of our existence through thought. Thought, and more broadly, the mind, is the only thing whose existence we cannot doubt. What's fascinating is that the first brick in the construction of truth is something immaterial, whereas in everyday life we usually associate reality with matter, bodies, and objects. Descartes builds all knowledge upon an immaterial truth, which is paradoxical. After discovering this first truth, the mother of all truths, Descartes profoundly influenced later thought. Although he was a Christian philosopher who attempted to prove the existence of God, God is not his starting point. His starting point is the individual, doubt, thought, and existence. This was nearly heretical in a period when traditional philosophy began with God. Descartes even supported Copernican ideas, but after learning of Galileo's persecution, he refrained from publishing similar work to avoid censorship. Finally, Descartes argues that thought possesses a higher degree of reality than matter. This recalls Plato's distinction between the material world and the world of ideas. For Descartes, thought is a substance, not physical, yet fully real. His famous example of the piece of wax shows that physical objects cannot be defined by their sensory properties, since these change. What defines the wax is not its color, shape, or texture, but its capacity to transform. This shows that essence lies beyond matter. Like Plato, Descartes believes that intelligible truths are eternal and timeless. Truth, in its deepest sense, belongs not to the material world, but to the realm of ideas and thought. In the end, for Descartes, what best defines human beings is not their physical body, but their immaterial, spiritual dimension, the mind. Matter changes, thought endures. And perhaps as a final poetic idea, the spirit needed a mirror, and we are that mirror. Yeah, and if that's the case, well, damn.